is, what it looks like, how fascism relates to it. But all of them are basically obsolete at this point. We're in a completely different year, 2020, and what both anti-fascism looks like as a social movement and what it's fighting against is uniquely different than it has been in their conditions anytime previously. So I wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit by looking at a couple of things that are happening where I am. So I'm in Portland, Oregon, and people probably have seen that we've had almost without interruption protests happening since May 29th. On May 29th, there was a large vigil in honor of George Floyd. People marched through the city. They broke through about 45 buildings, shattered windows on Starbucks, fast food places, things like that. Broke into the Justice Center, which is the federal law enforcement center, tossed around computers and set the building on fire. Right after that, they went down to what we kind of know as a luxury mall. It's kind of an expensive mall, Louis Vuitton. They broke in, looted Louis Vuitton, then went across the street and went for the Apple store. When they got through that, they went to the Verizon store. So that's how this started here. That's what the protests are like right now. Now, Portland tends to be a generally aggressive place. Pacific Northwest tends to be, but this is hypernormal. This is far beyond what might be the standard responses and stuff. And because of that, and that is because we're living in a heightened reality right now. We're living in a moment that far exceeds previous kind of conditions, and people are responding in kind. I wrote down a couple of headlines that had come out just in the last couple of days around Portland. Antifa rioters shoot at a cafe. Dangerous. Trump investigating Antifa radicals for federal property destruction. An Antifa conspiracy is taking over state politics. Oh my. Different candidates in Oregon. Will you condemn Antifa? Each charging each other to raise the stakes on condemning Antifa and anarchists. Sounds really scary. At the same time, we've been having a series of far-right rallies that haven't got the same amount of coverage. There was a Proud Boy rally just a couple of weeks ago with about 300 people armed and threatening, counter-protesters and reporters. There's been a rally almost every 2 or 3 days where armed people storm through the city, pointing AR-15s at protesters. On August 22nd, about 300 or 400 far-right people came. They attacked protesters, pointed guns, beat them with baseball bats, that kind of thing. Of just about a week before that, one far-right protester was shot and killed. And before that, a number of left-wing protesters had guns fired at them. There was pipe bombs thrown. There's been, I think, about 6 or 7 bomb attacks. That's just Portland. That does not circle into the rest of the country in any way. So I think it's important to think about, like, we are in a situation that's far exceeding how we would normally think about this. People's responses are far exceeding that. The conditions are far exceeding that. So a lot of this comes from just the conditions of the year we're in, coronavirus, the kind of rising movement against police violence and other things. But I think what it's going to force us to do is start to rethink about what we consider to be fascism, how we understand that, and what seems like an adequate response to confront it. So I wanted to start by just sort of defining terms a little bit, and I think that's important. So what is fascism? Well, so in my book, I define it along a certain kind of tradition, and it's a little bit, I guess, different than what you'll find a lot of political science professors or even a lot of activists tend to define it. So basically, I build around 2 real tentpoles. One is the belief in a centralized identity. Basically, this is that identity chooses you, you don't choose it. So race tends to be the dominant one that people talk about, but gender, sexual orientation, religion, there's a few of them. But basically, these are meant to be defining characteristics of a people and a civilization. So the idea is that, for example, race determines who you are, what your culture will look like, what your faculties are, all those sorts of things. That kind of belief in essential quality, which is something that generally liberal society has decided we've moved on back. This is basically a return to this essentialized notion. The second is that identity is unequal, that human beings are fundamentally unequal. One of the basic principles that modern society is built on, though it doesn't actually live this principle out in any meaningful way, is the idea that people are spoken of as fundamentally equal, either legislatively, legally, socially, or whatever. But the fascism is essentially a direct rejection of that. It's a reactionary turn to move away from these advancements that we consider part of modernity. Now, those are the 2 essential qualities that I put in the book. And one of the things that's actually difficult about this is that the definition, that's a moving target. That's a working definition. There's a lot of kind of secondary characteristics, many of which I might move up to the front if doing it again. And expect that we're going to have to constantly reify how we talk about this, because we're talking about something that's like grasping at straws. It's ephemeral, it changes, and the fundamental core of it has been really hard for people to grasp. What is it that motivates this far-right fascist movement? What makes it an insurgency? What makes it dangerous? This is complicated. The one other kind of secondary characteristics I might move up to the front is a revolutionary sense of itself. This is not just a far-right politics that enters into parliament and advocates for political programs. This is something that wants to destabilize the very fundamental basis of the government itself. And so that creates a lot of complications when we're talking about 2020, when Trump is in office, and how we should understand that. So let's go back a little bit and say, how do we understand fascism in a government? Now, since World War II, we generally understand fascists as people who don't have state power. We generally understand them as white nationalists, the resurgence of the Klan, even to a degree, street movements like in Europe, like European Defense League or Pegida, that are Islamophobic and against immigration. So we might understand them as these movements. But how do we understand it when we're having a question of those people's role in state power? Does a government become fascist because one of them becomes, a key legislator, or maybe even the president? What does it take for a government to shift to becoming fascist? Well, this creates the real complexity that we have here. We have a definition that's not fixed in stone, and we have a government that's shifting all the time. So when does it become a fascist government? When does anti-fascism become an anti-state movement? That's a really big question. I think that right now, it's important to think a little bit about how we've understood anti-fascism historically. So obviously, anti-fascism, the definition is pretty built right in there. It's people opposed to fascism. We have this kind of joke now that everyone's Antifa because who wouldn't be against fascism? That's a little bit simplified. Historically, anti-fascism, or particularly militant anti-fascism, is a movement against fascism that does not rely on the state. It's decided that the state has fundamental inequalities in it. It relies on certain kinds of racist power, i.e. the police. And so if you want to oppose fascism at a real fundamental core level, the underlying conditions of fascism itself, you can't rely on the state to do it. You have to go outside the realm of the state to confront fascism and to really unseat its growth. So we have sort of two movements here competing. We have fascism with a shifting target. We have anti-fascism that is defined by that target. It's defined by the thing it's going after, which is always changing. Therefore, anti-fascism has to always be changing. And so now we have a situation where even that shifting sand has changed. It's 2020. So we have a couple things going on. We have a president in office. This is the first thing that is basically, as far as we can tell, as far right as a contemporary movement would be, has basically motivated a far right, what we call populist insurgency in the US, similarly to as we've seen across Europe and other places. Trumpism is not an isolated phenomenon. It's part of a really sharp right-wing turn that's happening in politics across the world. This motivated the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil. This oriented the growth of what we call these far-right populist nationalist or national populist parties in Europe. Alternative for Deutschland, the Austrian Freedom Party, UKIP, and basically the Brexit referendum in Britain. All of these based around a return of this really strong nationalist element that focuses itself on trying to talk to people's concerns as like real base level. It basically takes economic and identity concerns and radicalizes them into a far right answer. That's happening in different countries, particular conditions. It's happening in India, for example, around conflicts between Hindus and Muslims. And that's happening in the US with Trump. That creates a situation in which we're really far outside the way we normally respond. Again, fascist movements tend to be in the minority, at least in our memory, they tended to be in the minority. The way we've understood them has been in the minority. And instead, the state is something slightly different. We have a fascist insurgency. We have the state and all the kind of problems to do with the state, the police, capitalism, the institutions that we're embedded in. And then we have the anti-fascists, which basically see themselves as having to fight both. But now we have basically the fascist movement and the state itself merging into really, really concrete ways. And so that tactical set starts to change, and how people think of anti-fascism starts to change. So that's one thing. That's the one by the new status quo. The second is something we've already talked about. We are not in the same room together right now. We would be traditionally, but we're not now. So social movements are built on cohesion, particularly militant social movements. You don't take militant social action with people you don't know. You don't do them with people that you've never been in the same room as. That's an incredibly frightening idea because they require trust, bonds that develop, ideas and tactics are developed from real working conditions. You're in a room, you figure out what you want to do, what's the best way to do that, and you get to know people and you work around people's particularities, their personalities, and that kind of things, and you develop a certain cohesion. A mass social movement has less of those personal bonds. When you have thousands of people, you don't all get to know each other. And that's okay, because it's basically built on this model of as many people as coming together as possible. Militant anti-fascism, where the word Antifa really comes from, was a little bit different. It was built on what a lot of organizers told me was actually a more professionalized skill set. People were trained on intervening in fascist organizing in a particular way, maybe higher risk because they were willing to push people out of spaces and things like that. And also they had to kind of protect their identities for fear of being attacked by like a neo-Nazi gang or something like that. So it was basically something people developed in really close quarters with each other over time. But again, you don't do that over a Zoom meeting. So the conditions are radically different. And so how people develop social movements and approaches are going to be radically different. The other thing is that people are out of work right now. So that has both a kind of a plus and a minus for building really strong social movements. The plus is that people have more free time. And I think that has contributed to some of the mass actions we've seen that people simply aren't at work. But then also the conditional issue is that people are also having to fight just to make basic ends meet. And that tends to take people outside of their struggles sometimes, being able to feel confident that they're going to be able to put their time and energy into something. We have not just Trump in office. That's not just the new status quo, but we now have the crisis of the 2020 election, which I would argue is a crisis that extends far beyond Trump. So we obviously have all the things we'd expect from Trump, concentration camps on the border, excessive policing, targeting of dissidents, attacking labor unions, basically everything that you expect from the far right. But we also have the destabilization of even the basic assumptions of a democracy. There's this kind of joke that goes around that, we may not really have a democracy, but we'll sure miss it when it's over. I'd argue that we actually had one to begin with, but this sense of increased crisis adds to an even more panicked response in a lot of the public. So if I back up a little bit to Portland, Oregon again, and I kind of mentioned a series of far-right rallies, and particularly by the Proud Boys being a kind of far-right street gang that's really big over here and tied to what we call like militia organizations, basically armed patriot groups from the rural areas, as well as these kind of Trumpist far-right groups that are in the cities. Well, they're now saying that they are, because they believe that Democrats and Antifa, they are one and the same, as funded by George Soros, are going to stage a coup on the election. They are going to post up with automatic weapons at ballot drop-off sites. This is not normal conditions. These are not the normal kind of avenues. And so I think this kind of attack on the sense of the election, the idea that maybe the president won't accept election results, that kind of, again, triggers something else in the sense of crisis that we have and how people are responding. And then the thing that I think is actually bigger than all of them is that we have the largest urban anti-racist insurgency in 50 years happening right now. We have one where militancy was the starting point. It was not something that escalated over time. It began as such. And one that, because of the police's response, never had the ability to moderate. So over time, social movements compromise. They decide, okay, well, a policy reform seems like it makes good sense. Maybe we'll go ahead and try and push for a candidate or something. Basically, it takes a very militant, radical, transformational, real fundamental idea like abolition, and it tempers it down to kind of get something that people want. That's how a large constituency tends to kind of work itself out. But that's not happening here. And the reason it's not happening here is that it's a movement against police violence that was met with excruciating police violence. So every single night in Portland, protesters go out into the streets. They demand for police violence to end, and they are beaten with batons, sprayed with CS gas, dragged along the street, screamed at, insulted. And so that has helped to make the protesters' case. It also has helped to make the fact that abolition is the only consensus solution on the ground in a lot of these places. People aren't talking about defunding, this part of the police department. They're not talking about employing more social workers to take this over. They're talking about getting rid of the fundamental basis of the carceral state. And it has continued this way for months now. So what's happening now is that people are kind of used to a militant tactical set. People are also used to now pushing the lines of what is even seen as acceptable on the left. So 2 days ago, there was a demonstration here in Portland, an Indigenous rights demonstration in advance of Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day. And what they did was essentially demand that no cameras were allowed. Normally there's a swarm of press at every one of these events. If you go there, it's Vice News, it's NBC, it's CNN. And instead they went and they tore down statues for George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and then they busted out the windows of the Oregon Historical Society. This is not something that liberals really like. It's Abraham Lincoln, a celebrated American president, and this is basically a museum that was trashed. It was trashed because it has indigenous artifacts in it. And so these are kind of critiques that take several steps removed from where a lot of the mainstream left, not even mainstream left, just left in general tends to be at. They're taking action far beyond that because the analysis has gone far beyond those incrementals. We're not just talking about the police. Now we're talking about colonialism. Now we're talking about the very basis of American society that's being kind of confronted. So the conditions of this has helped to radicalize even more people around this tactical set. So that's what we have in 2020. We have radical police violence that's leading to increased protest, really caustic kind of confrontations. We're talking about an election that could be literally stolen, and that's not hyperbole. That's not a conspiracy theory to say that at this point. I even, I did an op-ed for NBC because they basically emailed me and thought what does this mean that they're celebrating Kyle Rittenhouse, the vigilante in Kenosha? Does this mean that this is the new status quo for the GOP? It does mean that. We're in not just an economic crisis, but we're in one that is likely to last for years and one that we haven't seen the real brunt of, and it's going to be really difficult. And we have a pandemic that has been made worse, that people are denying the existence of, and will likely last for another year. So this is a situation that we haven't prepared for before. This is just fundamentally a different thing. So what is anti-fascism? What does it look like now? And this is a really complicated question. I go back a little bit to the question of Antifa, militant anti-fascism. So again, that kind of concept tends to be smaller groups, tend to have a particular tactical set that requires training, organizations that require vetting, all those sorts of things. Well, again, those are kind of difficult. One, because of the conditions of the coronavirus. Two, increased police kind of repression. And three, the fact that we're not just talking about like an insurgent group, we're talking about the entire system now. And so I think there's a few things that are starting to happen that are happening naturally, but also make sense when we're thinking of anti-fascism. So the first is this idea of integrated movements. So out here in Portland, there's an organization called Pop Mob, short for Popular Mobilization. So this came out of a particular situation as far-right groups started to grow and clearly had police support, in that in a demonstration, the police would flood in and they would attack really only one side, the left side. And so a series of organizers got together and were like, well, we just need more people there. So it's not a replacement for the anti-fascist bloc, the Black Bloc and things like that. It's not a replacement for that. It's sort of an addendum to it. So those people have a demonstration and they have a certain tactical set. And we also will, and we'll be right next side to them. So we'll basically try to get organizations to come on and get as many people as we can. This started in 2018. There was a particularly large Proud Boy rally that was coming. And in advance of that, for about 2 years, the Proud Boys would come every month or two, get in fights with protesters. And when I say, I feel like fights is mistaking it. They would just brutally beat protesters, drag them around, pull guns, beat them with batons, lots of traumatic brain injuries that came out of these attacks. Blood stains the street. And so they wanted these really kind of mass actions. It wasn't, again, not a replacement for the militant anti-fascist organizations like Rose City Antifa, but it was just sort of like, let's get as many people together as possible. And so they had a confrontation in the summer of 2018 where they got about 1,000 people out. And then so the Black Bloc kind of walked in front. So they were kind of the sharp edge of a large force of people that were right behind them that totally overwhelmed the downtown area. And this became a model that was replicated over and over again, where Pop Mob would sort of create a larger community event that was not, again, in replacement of the militant anti-fascists, but alongside it, basically with the talking point that, you know, it's all hands on deck time, and that we'll bring people out to here to do these big events, and we'll have like fun costumes and maybe music or milkshakes and things like that. And then at the same time, there's Black Bloc folks there to basically keep people safe, to stop Proud Boys from coming in and attacking people. This is sort of the idea of an integrated movement, but what it is saying is that this is an all hands on deck moment. Everything is going to be required, and we're openly acknowledging that the police aren't going to keep us safe in this situation. The only people that can keep us safe is us, so we need as many people as possible, and we need a certain amount of a general consensus that both anti-fascism is important and needed, and that we aren't going to basically throw each other under the bus for minor disagreements. This came from an idea called the St. Paul's Principles, which I'm not going to go into fully here, but one of them is basically that we're all here and we'll keep disagreements private because we're all here for a same goal, and we can acknowledge people's difference and also right to be here in collaboration. But this is actually, we're taking it an even step further in 2020. We have this integrated movement, these coalitions, basically some of these groups would be everything from, militant Black Bloc groups all the way to NAACP or labor unions. But we have to integrate this even more because the needs of 2020 are even more. So what we've started to see now is that what people's needs are going far beyond just the anti-fascist response. Anti-fascism is a responsive movement. It's not just something on its own, it's in response to something else. And so it usually gets basically honed down to be very specific. And it's generally better that way. It's better when it has one goal, stopping fascists, doesn't try and do everything else. But in 2020, we have a lot of needs simply to get people there safely. We need people to be able to come to these events. They need to have enough stability at home. They need to have access to healthcare, or basically staying healthy from things like coronavirus. Also out here in Portland, we had really, really bad forest fires in the summer, which basically brought our air quality to the worst in the world, made it almost impossible to go outside. And about 12% of the state were in displaced zones. So they were like being forced out of their homes and things like that. So part of what maintained an integrated social movement, which I think the other term for this might be social reproduction, was to be able to reproduce people's participation by supporting them through mutual aid. So mutual aid projects ended up being a really important component, not just of survival and getting through it, but of getting people to the stage where anti-fascism was even a possibility. So these ended up being dozens of groups really that did things like food distribution and help people get groceries and their medicine, things like that during the coronavirus. Groups that contacted distilleries so they could start getting alcohol to make hand sanitizer and getting that out to people. Street medic groups, which are groups that have a certain amount of training and provide immediate medical intervention to protesters, particularly if they're attacked by the police or the far right. They started providing a lot of that support, training people so they even reproduce their own movements. And that gave people a lot of the basic needs to survive so they could take that next step of participating in a social movement. That also took a next step when the protests started. So they were there to be able to help give people rides there. The same infrastructure that helped with the coronavirus was now helping reproduce the protests every night. They're getting people, again, the things they needed to stay safe from the coronavirus, or the things to treat injuries from the police, things like that. So one kind of intervened on another. Those groups that had started again with the coronavirus then had more experience because of the BLM protests, now had the same tools when the fire started happening to start helping people who are displaced. They had medics who were able to offer support. They knew how to get resources from one place to another. There's groups that were organizing these large hubs so they could get resources over to indigenous communities and reservations that were hit really hard by the fires, or were having the lack of access to water, things like that. So those infrastructures basically were able to extend themselves. So it ended up being a thing that if you're going to have not just an anti-fascist movement, but any social movement in 2020, mutual aid has to be a foundation of it because people can't survive without it. The same thing is going to end up being true about the kind of resulting conditions from the coronavirus that we haven't seen quite yet, as mass layoffs start to happen, as people are evicted from their homes. Those mutual aid networks become solidarity networks that have to confront those sorts of things. Because again, you don't have an anti-fascist movement if you have just absolute decimation in communities. People have to be able to depend on one another. They have to be able to get through those sorts of things. So that was basically the answer strong communities is an answer not just to what anti-fascism looks like now, but again, any social movement. What makes a mutual aid network dependable and successful is that communities are able to depend on one another. They know one another as best as they can. They make intentional moves to be connected with one another, and they're able to kind of create enough bonds that people see each other and understand each other's needs. And that's especially true now. Mutual aid was a piece of that, but it actually needs to go a step further. In 2020 and coming in 2021, as crisis likely increases, either because of climate change bringing things like fires in, or there's political instability, or the continuing pandemic, and what will likely not be the only pandemic in the future, those strong communities are going to be really important. And so a lot of organizations are creating kind of community-centric organizations just to get to know each other, just to do the first steps of really big basics. This is an extension of the mutual aid stuff. So there's organizations, for example, in Portland that do neighborhood groups like neighborhood councils. They try and confront real basic kind of neighborhood issues, have things like potlucks and get to know each other. And now that we have coronavirus making it difficult to be in the same room, they're using like social media groups and connecting in chat threads just to get to know each other, talk about what's going on so people aren't so lonely. It's sort of like a mutual aid light. It's the kind of very basic conditions of feeling as though you can ask somebody else for something. Right now, there's a lot of preparedness for the future, and I think this is in a way an extension of the mutual aid as well. A lot of people are concerned about what it's going to look like in November if, for example, there's political instability, president's not accepting election results, or if there's a whole great deal of turmoil, militias start coming in, that kind of thing. I'm in Oregon, and I'm in Portland, Oregon right now, but like within 6 or 7 miles of the city, it's incredibly rural. So it's a really rural state with a few cities in it. And the rural areas are dominated by militia movements. And there's a real reason for this. So the rural areas have had public services cut really severely. A lot of people don't know each other. A lot of places don't have high-speed internet. They don't have access to things like ambulances or libraries, or just kind of like really basic things a lot of people take for granted. And so militias basically form as their own version of a mutual aid network. They show up and say, well, hell, like we'll do a community patrol. We'll help you get to your doctor's appointment, things like that. And then they also offer a kind of far-right scapegoating ideas at the same time. Oh, we'll also protect you from Antifa. We'll protect you from immigrants, things like that. And so what's happening now is that in a moment of crisis, the militias already built their infrastructure in those communities. So when the fires began, so did a conspiracy theory that Antifa was setting the fires. Now, I don't need to tell you why that's stupid. I don't need to explain to you why that makes no logical sense, that there's no evidence of it, that there's no actual ideological pathway back to why Antifa would be setting fires in forests. But again, many years of fake news and Antifa scaremongering has led to this. And so in several counties, like militias were so profound that they were setting up checkpoints, stopping people from going in and out. It looked like the police had literally lost control in some of these. These are not far from the city. We're talking 10 miles from the city. And so these sorts of emergency responses by the far right are already there. They're ready to go. And what if people want to be able to counter that effectively, if they want to be able to have movements of their own, they have to be prepared in the same way. They have to be able to set foundations in those communities. They have to be able to know how to respond to a real serious emergency right away. And they need to be able to understand what it is going to take to flip the script in a lot of these communities. And that's going to require investing in rural areas. It's going to require communicating needs and ideas, and it's going to require building that infrastructure. And that kind of gets to my next point here is that there's a real need to communicate with the public about what this stuff means and what it is. Again, we're talking about a movement where on Sunday they shattered the windows of the museum. This is not something the liberal press was friendly to. It just wasn't. But there is a logic to it. There is a history there. And it's one that has to be communicated with people so they can at least understand what the conflicts are. And that's really important, actually, as thousands of people who dress in scary blast masks come out into the streets and try and fight back against both the police and far-right militias. We are living in a country right now where there's a lot of fear-mongering about the left, whatever they mean that to be, but radicals in particular. And we're also talking about at the same time a movement that's defined by those radicals. So we're talking about a large amount of fear that's around these particular movements that are kind of the only thing standing in between fascist attacks and the rest of the community. And so right now it's impending in 2020 in a crisis where Antifa means anything the far right decides it does. We have to have the ability to communicate with people about what this all is going to mean, and to communicate why tactics are chosen, what the reasoning is, and how people are involved in it, and that these are everyday people trying to figure out a way, a solution to protect themselves and give us a dignified way of living. So this is a tall order. That's what 2020 looks like right now. And I think to get back to the question of fascism and whether or not this is fascism, this is encroaching fascism, I think at times this is important because we have to kind of understand what the appropriate response is, how do you explain it? And because anti-fascism is responsive, you have to know what the threat is that you're responding to. That's a really key part of it. But it's not the only question. There's a situation, as we said, where there's shifting sands between both the state and these non-state extrajudicial actors. And the reality is that extrajudicial violence is a component of state violence, and it always has been. I was talking with my friend Vicky Osterweil the other day, and she wrote a book called In Defense of Looting about looting and the protests. The book really starts with Ferguson. Protests in 2014 is where she started kind of thinking about this idea, but it's just as applicable today. And one of the things she was talking about is that people are really shocked by all these Proud Boy attacks and the police complicity with the Proud Boy attacks. In Portland on August 22nd, when the Proud Boys came and started attacking left-wing protesters, the police stood down. And that was the only time the police had stood down in 3 months. They had been brutally attacking protesters every single night, and they did it again that night. They just wouldn't do it when it was the far-right people running the violence. And people seem really shocked by this. But historically, there has always been this level of collaboration between far-right militias who kind of carry out social control, basically putting down dissident folks, marginalized communities, that kind of thing, demanding rights. And then the state that has basically two levels of violence, the violence they commit and the violence that they refuse to intervene on. But that is the historical legacy of it. And that means, and I think when we understand that, is that these sort of shifting sands, whether it's the police or it's a far-right militia, there is basically a kind of a web here that's going on of social control and a certain kind of way of thinking and political politics. And no matter if it's becoming more in the state with Trump and the far-right implementing those, or it's more in the world of militias, either one of them require a movement to push against them. But fundamentally, what it's going to require is movements to see two components of this: what I call insurgent fascist groups, far-right militias, gangs, things like that, and then the state that has certain levels of complicity with it, and both of which are going to have to be seen as really important components of an anti-fascism in 2020. The other thing is that there is no other side to this. We are not going to get to the other side of November and have any amount of relief. If, for example, Trump refuses to leave office, the violence will increase. Trump's policies will only become more magnitude, attacks on unions, increased border policing, border fascism. If he doesn't, and there's actually some way to remove him from the White House, we're going to be talking about militia attacks. We're going to be talking about far-right insurgent things, violence against protesters. Conspiracy theories are increasing. I mean, right, literally, QAnon, one of the most bizarre conspiracy theories in the modern world, it has 22 major candidates running on its platform. This is a different world. And so this question of social reproduction, the things that we talked about with mutual aid and solidarity groups and protecting each other and getting to know each other, that's really important because anti-fascism is now the permanent state of being. It's going to have to be a movement that continues to go on for years and years because it's going to be continuing to be a condition of our changing world. This is not a safe space that we're in right now. We're living in an era where climate change is going to lead to mass crisis, economic collapse is very likely, and the response by both the state and a large portion of the public is a far-right, basically tribalist, whites-only response. It's basically one where they will fight and attack marginalized communities in protection of privilege, and we have to be able to have a counterbalance to that that's permanent, a kind of state of permanent anti-fascism that people can depend on and continue to innovate in and change and adapt to the conditions. So, more important than anti-fascism, more important than understanding fascism, is the things that make anti-fascism successful. Strong communities, mutual aid networks, defense and solidarity, previous organizations, figuring out ways of mobilizing organizations like unions and even church groups and things like that. Having these be vibrant and having them be a piece of an integrated movement, all of them together, adapting to fascism and the far-right threat and attacks on immigrants and attacks on queer folks, having that be the permanent state of being is what makes these movements successful. There's a lot of focus on particular tactics, particular types of organizations, particular phrasings, particular words. But the reality is that strong communities, strong organizations, strong commitment, ability to communicate, strong bonds between people is a revolutionary infrastructure that movements are built on, and they are what makes it successful into the future. So if you want to see anti-fascism successful past 2020, it starts with creating those bonds, because the state and far-right groups and a lot of the infrastructure simply isn't going to do it. It's not going to protect us in the coming years. We have to protect ourselves, and that's, I think, the foundation of an anti-fascism going forward. So that's what I got. I wanted to jump into questions and conversation. I would love to jump into that.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a couple of questions. And while I'm doing that, if those of you who are interested in asking a question can either jump on the Q&A or on the chat, and we'll work them from there. So the first one, I saw an article over the weekend from Business Insider, not what you would expect to be a radical publication, and it essentially, the headline was something to the effect of Republicans have embraced white supremacy. You know, coming from Business Insider, I found to be shocking, and yet the more I think about that, especially in the context of what you're saying, I think we have to prepare ourselves for this to mainstream in some way, shape, or form. And so my question is, if Biden wins, what does that mean for fascism? I mean, you seem to be implying that that is not going to result, obviously, in a government no longer being fascist. What does it mean?
Well, it means a few things. So on the one hand, that the GOP, I always find it kind of funny when people do like say the GOP has embraced white supremacy. I'm like, yeah, 100 years ago. So it's like, but what I think is actually a rhetorical difference that means.
But Business Insider doesn't usually say it, I guess is the point, right?
I think what they have embraced is white nationalism, and that means something different. And I think it's important to unpack that. I mean, white supremacy is much more endemic to the culture, but white nationalism is like a very conscious, particular type of white identity politics that the GOP has embraced. It's sort of conscious. There was many years ago, I want to say this is 2011, but I have to double check. Richard Spencer, who people probably know as the founder of the alt-right movement, and he had an organization, or he has an organization called the National Policy Institute. He did this sort of like white paper and presentation where he invited the press. And this was long before Trump. I guess maybe not. Maybe 2014 is now I'm thinking about it. Long before Trump. And he basically offered up this proposal called the majority strategy. And this is like one that basically the GOP is essentially statistically the party of white people. So it's important to actually just stop minority outreach. Instead, they should have more effectively target white people as white people. And in doing so, he's like, they'd be successful. Since they're not successfully targeting non-white people anyway, they should just forget them. That's the Richard Spencer approach. Well, that's what Trump did verbatim. That's exactly what he did. He followed the majority strategy explicitly. And in doing so, just basically made everything manifest. A lot of what fascism does is it makes the implicit explicit. So we have an implicitly white supremacist society. Let's just make it explicit. We have colonialism implicit to the kind of founding of states. Let's just make it explicit and turn it back on ourselves. And so that's what basically Trumpism and the allied GOP has done, is they've transformed it into an open, kind of conscious white identity politic. What I think they've done in 2020 is they've embraced the vigilante as like basically the voter identity. That's what I wrote for NBC, was that they have this model of the vigilante as the rank and file GOP now. So like the vigilante as an idea is the person who basically breaks the rules to follow even bigger rules. So they break the rules to set things right. And what that does is it actually gives them a voter base, because it basically energizes people. By turning them into vigilantes, it turns them into people who take action. People who take action, they vote, but they also do other things. So the side effect is that there's got a large portion of the GOP base that's willing to basically break the law and engage in violence on the Kyle Rittenhouse model to set things right. And they're constantly trumping that. I mean, they're constantly building up that sense of identity. The idea that injustice is happening, that Antifa is this militant new communist force that's about to overthrow the government, that only you strong men who follow like the will of God are able to kind of take it back. So if Joe Biden wins, it'll probably play out in a very particular way. So first off, because of the whole absentee ballot situation, it's going to be the red mirage. It will look like Trump is in the lead on the night of, and 3 or 4 weeks later, Biden will actually be declared the winner. That's long enough time for Trump to say that there was, nefarious actions, maybe Soros funded Antifa to stage ballots or whatever. Let's get wild with it. But what that's going to do is mobilize that vigilante base. So there's a number of ways that Trump could obviously stop himself from being removed from the White House. There's the state is not like a neutral arbiter by any means, but it also could lead to these vigilante attacks, what we call like seemingly impulsive violence. It's not totally lone wolf. It's not like it's totally disconnected from the movement, but it seems impulsive, and that impulsive violent behavior has been cultivated so completely by the GOP that it's a guarantee of violence. I don't say things are guarantees very often, but this is a guarantee of violence. So I think that's what we have to expect. I mean, the other thing is that what is Biden exactly? Is he someone that's going to kind of undo the things that Trump has done? Maybe some of them. Again, though, one of the successes of Trumpism was that it transformed the mass populace. One thing I think people are uncomfortable with is the idea that fascism is a mass movement, that it's not just a top-down movement. It's not just people in state power. Working class white people participate in it. They participate because they think it's in their interests. And so I think one of the things is that he's cultivated a movement that's not going to disappear with Biden. So whether or not Biden gives us like moderate changes to Trump's kind of like violent border imperialism, I don't know if that's going to fundamentally change our conditions that much. I only think we do. I mean, I think that we have the ability to confront those conditions. If Trump built a mass movement of people doing things, we have the ability of building participation as a counterforce.
So you sort of led right into what my second question was, which is, when I've thought about fascism historically and in the early couple of years of the Trump administration, the way that I would tend to respond is, what really distinguishes what we have in America from Weimar Germany is the brown shirts, right? And yet it seems that maybe we're getting the brown shirts now, that the militia are being consolidated, are being co-opted into a movement that supports the government in a way that would lend itself very well to that kind of militarization of society. Is that a fair assessment of first of all, the difference between Weimar Germany and the early stages of the Trump administration, but also that there is some sort of parallel that we could draw between these militias and the brown shirts?
Yeah, one of the reasons that I actually use the definition that I do in the book about fascism is that a lot of what I always kind of called the poli-sci approach to it was to look at statecraft and the behaviors of statecraft as a defining essential quality. And the problem with that is that we do not have states that look like Weimar Germany or like Italy or Spain or Romania. We just don't have, our governments don't look like that. We kind of talk about, for example, like Germany as this kind of sophisticated totalitarian operation, but actually it's a really primitive state as states go. I mean, they would have killed for the kind of like apparatus that the US government has in terms of like popular control and militarization and that kind of thing. And they also had political parties that were fundamentally different than they do now, and social movements that were fundamentally different than they do now. So you had kind of brown shirts that were sort of like a paramilitary associated with a political party, and we can't imagine that playing itself out with the GOP because it just simply functions so much differently. But I think if we actually decouple a little bit about how we define things from that particular statecraft, we have a different set of answers. So the first thing is that social movements work differently today than they did then. They're more diffuse. I kind of think of like Negri and Hart's concept of the multitude. I think of like they actually exist in intersecting multitudes. And so the social networks are kind of more important, and the way that movements form around ideologies rather than organizations is important. So Spencer Sunshine had this term, independent Trumpists, for this kind of collection of far-right people that maybe weren't associated with the GOP or even necessarily organizations, but they all seem to kind of coalesce together. They have a common set of ideas that are based along sharing ideologies and conspiracy theories and things like that, where there's a certain consensus understanding of the world that starts to form. And so when we're looking for state apparatus of the past, we're not going to find it because they just don't work that way. The governments don't work that way. The political parties don't work that way. Activists don't work that way anymore. Instead, we have these diffuse social movements. So again, are these groups the new brown shirts? I would actually maybe even stay a step further and say not even the Proud Boys or the militias, because when we're looking for militias, specifically militia organizations, or we're looking specifically for Proud Boys, those numbers are quite small. It's not them that cause the violence necessarily. It's the entire sphere around them that act in collaboration or have the same identity and way of thinking. So again, when we're talking about seemingly impulsive violence, we're not necessarily talking about like a militia organizes violence. We're talking about people in a militia way of thinking that take kind of renegade action. In a lot of ways, far-right organizations tend to moderate their membership because they have, top-down control and people who can get in trouble and things like that. It's actually when those organizations start to break down and when the movement becomes more diffused, statistically, that more violent attacks happen. So I think in a way, the brown shirts we're looking at is not even organizational. It's a cultural kind of condition of vigilante violence, people that come out and consider themselves defenders of the American rights. Like on August 22nd, they came out and they used black. They said they were a Back the Blue rally. But what they said to anyone that asked them was they were defending the city against Antifa. Many organizations and just individuals were now the defending force. They were going to do what it takes to defend against this malicious onslaught. So I think in a way, the new brown shirts is just a kind of broad collectivity of people that don't even need to be associated with an organization. It's almost like we've moved to a post-organization level.
Interesting. Okay, Sam, you're up.
Hello. Well, thank you for being here, Shane. The question I had was, like, obviously, like, being in this class, like, I would consider myself Antifa, I'm not right-leaning, but I guess a question would be, how do you maybe like talk to people or inform people that maybe aren't like super far right but are still like voting for Trump or something like that, either because of like information that they think or like they're just not as like people who don't see what's happening the way we do? Like, how do you try and breach that, I guess?
Sure. I don't think that there's a really great answer for that. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a silver bullet on that.
It's more of an advice question, really.
I think in a way, there's always like a couple times a year, you'll see a flood of articles like how to, usually around Thanksgiving, how do you talk to your Trump voting uncle? How do you change his mind? I don't think you do generally. I think that it's actually a much more ephemeral idea to change people's minds on specific issues, particularly when it's related to party politics or kind of name brand politics, Antifa, Trump, Democrats, things like that. I think what's important is actually to do the maybe less rewarding work, immediately rewarding work of building a certain kind of common base. Like if we think about why like rural America supports the right so much, even though it's against their economic interest and it's certainly not helpful to anything, it's that basically right-wing people invested in them for a very long time in talking with them, explaining their worldview, convincing people. And the left was a bunch of like city dwellers that looked down on poor people. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Like that culture of elitist like college stuff was real. And so I think the reality is that we have a bigger task of shifting those perspectives over decades by organizing in spaces, providing solidarity and mutual aid. I think mutual aid and solidarity work for struggling folks in those areas is going to be the most important thing for actually shifting those dynamics away from it. I think it's harder when you're confronting a specific instance and changing someone's mind. One of the things is that like a lot of the discussion about Antifa is based entirely on falsehood. We're not even talking about ideas or disagreements anymore. We're talking about a lack of consensus reality. Antifa, a movement which is just, infinitely less violent than the far right. Even just like small far right rallies. But we have basically, several years now of basically conspiracy mongering and kind of like false representations of events and things like that. So I think it's important actually to start at maybe a more base level and start to work around common interests and around a solidarity model, saying like, okay, well, let's actually confront what people's actual issues are and building a base there, and then using that as a way to confront kind of reactionary attitudes. The other part of this, though, is that what I think is interesting about anti-fascism is that it takes a defense first model. So convincing people and changing their mind is really important. I think working class people should be confronted with that. They should change their minds. It's not in their interests. White working class people should be challenged on their white supremacist attitudes and have that shifted. But anti-fascism decides that defending people from violence is the most important thing first, and that the other stuff comes later. So I think it's always a challenge to say, like, is this a situation when I should kind of like quarantine the harm? Or is it a situation when I should invest in that person? I mean, obviously, if it's like a family member, I think people will probably want to invest in those. But I think, again, it's going to be a long game. I don't think that just challenging people right off the bat, confronting them, or certainly calling them on lies and falsehoods does not tend to work. I think instead, it's actually building the conditions in which you can have a shared experience.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, Atreyu.
Hello.
Hey.
Sorry, I was not expecting to be called up here like that.
Cool.
I just typed out a question, but I'm not sure where it went. Everything disappeared for a second.
Let me look. I think I see it. Oh, maybe it's in the Q&A section.
Yeah, it's a nature question.
Yeah, it's in the Q&A section.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do you believe that strife is inextinguishable constant of human society, or that there are changes that we can make, however difficult, that can thrust humankind into an era of peace? Well, y'all came with the big questions today. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a certain amount of strife that's inherent to the human condition. Yeah, I mean, like, we live in a material world. People die, we can't stop it from happening. Like, I think that absolutely, that this is not, that having a big vision is not one that's purely utopian. That's sort of like, we can fix all the problems and we'll be perfectly happy. I don't think that's the case. I think radical politics actually is built on utopianism to a degree. I think that abandoning that is a kind of a misstep, because people are meant to dream big, to shoot really big. I think the question more should be is what amount of this suffering is totally unnecessary, and how much of it is kind of been excused by deeply laid ideological concepts. So like, how much of this, for example, like wealth inequality, I think is the most black and white easy thing to see. Does it make sense that 8 people have as much wealth as several billion? No, of course not. There's no way of conceiving of the world in which that would be a reasonable amount of suffering, or for example, the amount of coronavirus deaths that we have right now. There's absolutely no way we can think about this as that any properly functioning society would allow something like that to happen. So I think the questions end up being, what do we kind of allow it to be? The other thing is, like, what kinds of social conditions do we think is preferable? Do we think that having inequality, like economic, social inequality, is acceptable? We can't stop every kind of bad thing from happening, but we can look at the things we've actually built, the things that we've decided are the best way to operate society, and challenge those basic assumptions. And so I think in a way, radical politics is an extreme countervision. Let's try something new, but it's also likely to be one that constants itself, that even if, for example, a bunch of radicals got the society they wanted, they would continue having to be radicals and challenging those ideas. It would have to continue to discover itself, because it's people, human beings, trying to build it. But I think right now we have some basic work to do, because we haven't even built the foundations of people trying. This is not a society of people trying to make it the best they can. That's not how we've organized things. And so I think it's important to look at exactly what kind of level of suffering we have, what is basically done, like we've performed ourselves, our society has performed this sort of suffering on ourselves, and what capacity we have to undo it. I think it's also important to look at who benefits and who doesn't. Like, this is not just like a bunch of people got together and made poor choices. Like, it's not like we as a society just went down the wrong road at some point. People chose for that to happen, particular people in positions of power who benefit from it. And so I think it's important to kind of look at how that plays out too. But yeah, I think, in the most utopian world, there will still be a lot of problems. There's no way to get rid of that. I think that's okay. I think it's actually the striving to make it better that's important.
Okay, Isabella.
Hi. Okay, so this is kind of a longer question, but something that I wanted to pick your brain at. So it seems like our country prides itself on separating church and state, and being free in that sense, and how we were talking about the differences between like us and Germany. But it seems like pretty much any political campaign surrounds itself with displaying morals through religious values. So like, and it's usually on either sides too. So like, why do you think, or do you think we'll ever have a successful atheist candidate? And why do you think that religion equals morality in that sense? Because it seems like, you know, the more traditional religious party, and let's be honest, it's the Republican side. I mean, they seem to suck more, right? Like, I'm just like, I don't know how else to phrase that. And then I was also wondering, like, do you think that there will be a peaceful transition of power? And if not, how do you think that's going to look with the way, you know, and you're kind of talking about how the administration is kind of, or how he, I don't know how to phrase it. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Okay, I'll try and go after each.
I try to write it out. Sorry.
Totally. You know, I don't. So yeah, obviously both parties appeal to religiosity and piety. I would argue that their appeals to religion tends to be more about politics than it has to do with religion. So like there's no reason to believe that the basically Republican Party's evangelical base, their interpretation of Christianity is more correct than liberation theologists, you know, Marxist revolutionaries. There's no reason looking at scripture to say that one is over the other. Generally, scripture is interpretable enough that it can basically back whatever kind of nonsense politics people are pushing for, usually in the support of power, you know, usually in the support of whatever kind of dominant party position they're doing. That's why the politics of the Christian right in the US was really built around the maintenance of white supremacy, much more so than any kind of religiosity. If you look at the development of what we call the religious right in the late 70s and the early 80s, it really was built around fighting school desegregation and basically supporting white flight academies. It wasn't so much built around what became wedge issues. Those were made like abortion or LGBT rights. Those actually became later. They were actually kind of formed around this maintenance of these Christian white schools. And so in a lot of ways, the religiosity is a language that people understand to communicate other sorts of ideas. And so they basically these privileging of power and things like that. And this is in a lot of ways actually the success they had with rural folks in general, is that they were communicating essentially the elitist politics, but they were doing it in language that religious people understood, and the left stopped doing that. They stopped actually communicating with respectability and communicating through that language. Even scripture itself is the result of political partisan. I mean, like all of it is actually a manifestation of politics, much more though so than an essential quality. Can there be an atheist candidate? I'm not sure. I mean, probably not in the immediacy, but I wonder if that matters less than the way that the politics of it are sort of handled. Again, I don't necessarily think that, for example, the boundaries between church and state have broken down so profoundly that the church is influencing the state. I think that the language of the church is used to justify whatever nonsense politics they're pushing through, you know? So for example, like abortion is not an issue of Christian prohibition. Christianity as a religion is not attacking our abortion rights. Men are attacking women's rights to self-autonomy, and they're quoting the Bible to do it. That's what it is, you know? And so I think, you know, we've likely had candidates that have come through a major office that are atheist. Well, I know there have been people who have come through as atheists, but there's likely religious people who are also atheists as well. They just found, you know, some church to attend and kind of say that kind of thing. I think the question is going to be is what effect like evangelical voting bases and demographics actually have in the coming politics. You know, they've moved much further right than they were before. They supported, for example, Trump, who's not by any means a Christian candidate, much more effectively than they did Bush, who was the super Christian candidate. And it's because they actually don't care about Christianity. They care about winning victories. They care about who's on the Supreme Court so they can stop abortion and attack women. They worry, but they want to get the person in there who's going to attack trans folks trying to go to the bathroom. That's what they care about. And so I think that ends up being the larger question. The tying of morality, I think, yeah, I mean, people have ceded the ground of morality to the right very effectively. And I think, again, it comes from a problematic dimension in a lot of urban leftist communities of not being willing to speak to the language that lots of people understand. People understand things in terms of morality, for example, and they understand that morality largely through like the heavy focus on that rhetoric from like religious upbringing and things like that. People need to have the ability to communicate on that language, even if they don't share those religious convictions. And I think that the other thing is that the left, both the moderate left and even the radical left, are pretty weak on these things. So like, like you can't expect Democrats to actually defend themselves in any of their values in any meaningful way, because they're not meaningfully different. They're not meaningfully different from the Republicans in a profound sense. And so they are not actually going to defend the right to having morals of their own. That's not something that they're out there fighting for necessarily. When they do it, it's Joe Biden being talked over by Trump. And so I think that's a big part of the problem. It's the kind of like the weak lack of strategic avenues on that level. Remind me the other one. I just talked too much and I forgot the other question.
No, thank you. And that actually cleared up a lot for me. So I was wondering if you think that there will be a peaceful transfer of power, because he's very much avoiding that and just saying, it's okay, we don't plan on losing. But I was wondering, how do you think that would actually look like, though, if there isn't a peaceful transfer of power? Because that's kind of freaking me out, especially when we were talking about, the brown suits. Yeah, I just don't want anything to happen like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't say definitively one way or the other, but let's put it this way. So, I keep thinking back to the kind of days before Nixon resigned, where like basically loyalists came in and said, okay, this is what you can do. You can go into Congress, you can disband the Senate, you can have the military march in there. Like there was literally on the table, you could stage a coup on the government. So that was possible. Nixon decided, no, that's a bad idea. It's not going to work, whatever. Also, and step down. Trump obviously doesn't have the sense of that. So it could try all those sorts of things. We don't have a precedent for it, so it's really hard to say how it would play. If he didn't, if there wasn't, for example, he said that the election was rigged, he was refusing to leave, that kind of thing, then yeah, I mean that's the first step of the dissolution of the United States. There's absolutely no way of maintaining that. That would be the break in the Western consensus, and we will be moving towards a post-American society, and there's absolutely no way, to be honest. Because of just the fracturing of the political nature, the economy, climate collapse, those things could be inevitable anyway. But yeah, I think it would end up being a really, really dangerous, caustic situation. I think Trump isn't stupid. I think he'll look at how contentious the election actually is. Like, are they actually close in the election? Does it actually look like it could have been rigged? How much support does he have from his base? Is the rest of the party willing to fracture the country? It's debatable. I mean, these are not monolithic organizations or institutions. They're made up of competing factors. Even the state itself is made up of competing factors. So I think it depends on all those things. Also, I think it depends on whether or not, like, basically rich business owners are going to say having Trump maintain an authoritarian presidency is more in our favor than maintaining a structured economy. It's really, really hard to say. I can say that just the fact that we have to ask this and really don't know, we really don't know the answer to it, I think that actually speaks to the moment we're in most.
Okay, Professor Colton, you're up.
There we go. Sorry. All right. Thank you. So I guess my question is about media, and I'll start by saying I understand mistrust of mainstream media, of course, in covering things realistically as they really did happen. But I'm worried about who gets to control the narrative, and I want to find out your thoughts on that. When you mentioned the trashing of the museum, for instance, and there was a sense, oh, don't allow cameras there. Well, at some point somebody will present that and provide their own narrative of what happened, unless it is controlled by the people who did it. So I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and what role the media might have in movements today, and if media isn't trusted, mainstream media, then what options exist?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not controversial to say that trashing a museum is not a popular move, and it's not always a great look with people, particularly also banning cameras. I mean, like, that's not a judgment call on people's tactics. They have their own reasons, things like that, but we know how those things look, and I think that's a totally fair thing to throw out there. And again, as a movement kind of consolidates to being the most militant aspect of it, it tends to have the worst media's representation for two reasons. One, the media can't make sense of it and doesn't want to. And two, the people involved reject the media, basically. They reject the participation in spreading narrative. And so it can be both kind of poor. So I think, I mean, again, this goes back to like the need to communicate with the public. If a social movement is going to take action, particularly action that seems far outside the norm of how problems are solved or how behavior is supposed to be, then they need to be able to communicate that. That's just an essential piece of it. It's literally just bad organizing if you don't do that. It's giving up on the ability to persuade other people and bring them in. That being said, there's an interplay between taking action and communicating about that action. So on the one hand, there may be action that organizers think is effective or protesters think is effective that is more important than communicating about that. And I understand that at the same token. So it's always a balancing act. You know, we do live in we're talking about fake news a lot right now. We're talking about the misinformation. I read some headlines. The first one was that Antifa shot at a cafe on that night. Well, the reality is that there's no evidence that happened. It's a really big headline right now. There's stories all over the place. There's zero information. There's zero evidence that happened. The other one was that Antifa took a quilt out of the Oregon Historical Society and trashed it. And it was a quilt that was sewn by 5 or 15 Black artists in the area. Well, that didn't happen either. I had photographers that followed the protest and then took photos right afterwards, and the quilt was totally in there and fine. Frankly, someone just kind of came by and after the fact and kind of messed with it. So like the reality is that people are setting narrative things that we don't have control over, and they continue to do that. That's a pretty consistent piece of media history, is that partisan media that's done for a particular reason, that maintains kind of falsehoods. That is not a new thing. It's not new to being right now. We have a particularly loud person that's doing it in the way of Trump, and we have a lot of language for it, and social media, it goes much quicker, but it's the same model. So I think instead of trying to crush those media narratives, it's important to just constantly communicate those sorts of things, to put out independent media and to confront it, to have really open answers, and to have effective media strategies to a degree. You know, I think that there's a use in thinking about how to communicate things all the time and what utility that has. You know, so you have a movement, it has particular goals, and then you have the ability to communicate about that movement and explain it to the other public. And I think, frankly, that's just like a skill in short supply and not one that's around all the time. And I think that a blanket rejection of the media, I'm saying this as a media person, so clearly I think I'm important, but you know, the blanket rejection of the media ends up being, I think, at people's cost. But well, the one caveat I had to that, like I said earlier, is I don't think that's the end of the story. There's a rhetoric that gets used against anti-fascist protesters a lot that, you know, when they know platform, meaning they disallow a far-right person to speak, it actually makes those people look sympathetic. That is statistically not true. And the reality is that actually stopping the far-right person from speaking without question actually slows down their movement. What helps their movement is not sympathy through the media. What helps their movement is their ability to organize and speak. So I think it's important to think about the social movement not just as a media vessel, not just as a way of winning media coverage, but instead, how do you get to your goals? And then how does media help or hurt that? And then thinking about it in that context. So having an appropriate thing. I think as a media person, though, you have a different mission, which is to try and do things accurately and also communicate ideas and things. And I think doing that more consciously and being critical of these sort of media narratives. You know, I often do reporting, pretty normal reporting for like Al Jazeera and stuff, inside of a social movement. And so I know those movements pretty well, and I feel like I can communicate about them accurately in a way that a lot of other people get wrong. So I think it's important to have that stuff as well.
Okay, Ellen.
Hi. Thank you so much for this conversation. So my question, you touched on like the Proud Boys and these militia groups that are sort of doing their own kind of community organizing. My question is sort of around that. I don't have a ton of trust in, you know, the Biden administration or the state's going to come in and fix everything. But it's clear that a lot of the far right's policies do not actually help these people. They are voting, they are acting against their own best interest. And with how fractured we are right now, with the spread of misinformation, with the rise of these conspiracy theories, I remember like 6 years ago, I was more concerned that, 4% of Americans thought reptilians were real. And now it's far past that. Is there anything, like, what can we do to get through to these people? Yeah. I mean, I think like Oath Keepers, you mentioned Proud Boys, but I want to say Oath Keepers are recruiting it's clear that they're recruiting ex-military and ex-police. I believe they're like 25,000 strong.
So the first thing is to counter their recruiting goals. So there's a good story from an organization out here. It's called the Rural Organizing Project, and it's sort of like a progressive-y nonprofit kind of group. But they do a lot of good work. And what they do is they create like these local groups in rural areas. So I think they have like 50 local groups around Oregon. So it's like really small towns and stuff. And so, for example, there was an area where someone had, I think the story goes is someone had been robbed or something. And it took the police like 2 hours to get there. And so the militia showed up and said like, oh, well, we'll come protect you and we'll do this, neighborhood watch. And they started building this militia group and stuff. So the Rural Organizing Project came in, talked to people, said like, what do you need? They're like, well, we don't know our neighbors. We don't know what's going on. And they're like, okay. So what they did was they got some computers. They put them at the general store because they don't have high-speed internet in these areas. They put some computers there. They help people create a newsletter and some community meetings, just really basic stuff. Get to know your neighbors and stuff. That literally was enough that people started doing that, got to know their neighbors, and then kicked out the militia because they didn't need the militia. They feel like, well, everything that the militia was providing, we now have. So there's a certain amount of the conditions. And in doing so, having a liberation mentality of mutual aid and solidarity, of like community empowerment, and not relying on just more state services or things, but people doing it together themselves, I think that counters it. A lot of what the militia rhetoric is sort of a parody of radical left rhetoric. Oh, we're going to take care of ourselves. We are the community. We're going to protect ourselves. And then they kind of flood in some far right stuff in there as well. Other groups have done this, I think, a different way. There's a group that's now defunct called Redneck Revolt that basically worked in rural areas and did like gun training, like these gun self-defense groups and things like that, and talked to people and said, well, you don't have to, like, we're pro-gun and we're anti-democrat, like, come with us. And they had actually a lot more success than people give them credit for actually breaking up militias by basically going to the young people that were there and attracted to militias and offering them some of the things they wanted, which was like a rural identity and guns, they wanted guns, and then saying you can have that without the rest. And that actually was successful. And actually getting the Oath Keepers to break their, because the Oath Keepers are a radical right group, but they are slightly more moderate than a lot of the other groups. Redneck Revolt would call the Oath Keepers and break the solidarity between them and other far right groups, like broke the solidarity between them and the Proud Boys quite often. By trying to speak a common language. These are just a couple examples, but I think that the fundamental core is that, like, when we're not there, somebody else is there. That's that old line that if you're not talking to your coworker, the Klan is, that kind of thing, of like a union organizer. That it's really true. People are in crisis. They're confused if this is economic crisis or identity crisis, whatever it is, and they don't have people filling those narratives and organizing to solve those problems. And so somebody else brings a narrative to it. There is nothing about material conditions that guarantees that people are going to choose the right choice. Crisis can make people choose all kinds of things. And I think what happens is that we have to actually intervene on those crisis moments to actually create a more positive outcome. And unfortunately, like, there's a lot of actual cultural divides that have broken that down and and we've ceded that ground to the right. We've just let it be theirs. And it doesn't naturally have to be theirs. I mean, Kansas used to be the center of the Socialist Party. There is no reason that these places have to be theirs,
Okay, I think we've only got time for one more question. So Vi, you're gonna get the last word. It'll have to be a quick one though. So, what I would ask is that Nicole and Tina, you've had your hands up for a while. If you could type your question in, maybe we can pass that along and see if we could get an answer after the fact. And I just want to say thanks so much. This has been really informative and useful, and really hitting on a lot of the topics that we've been addressing, not only through the course, but that we've all been thinking about in terms of mainstream issues in society today.
I'm glad to be invited.
All right, so Vi, your last question.
Okay, so my question is, should respectability politics still be considered when resisting fascism? if if you look at historically groups like the SCLC, they would go out and march in the streets in suits and ties because they wanted to maintain the appearance of respectability. Whereas the current sort of mainstream opinion on Antifa is, there are these people, like you said, in scary black masks who are out burning and looting and, causing chaos. So is that still something that is important to consider?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I think it is in some venues and not in others. Again, anti-fascist, like we have to go back to praxis because militant anti-fascism was not actually built on communicating necessarily to the public. It was meant on stopping something from taking place. And the idea was that the success came from stopping it, not from communicating about it, but stopping it. So like if we think about particularly early not early, but mid-century anti-fascist groups in like the 70s and 80s in Britain, they're trying to stop the National Front from organizing and having events. And then later, like the British movement, other things, another kind of far-right groups led to the British National Party in Britain. So they wanted those groups, anytime they were able to speak, they grew and they were able to attack immigrant folks because of their growing. So by stopping them from growing, to do so, you have to stop their events. Then it will have this effect down the line. No matter what they look like, no matter who's there, it stops it. That's the goal. At the same time, though, they aren't the only anti-fascist group, right? So, like you said, the SCLC had like these suit and ties. They were really the public presentation, a real focus on communicating the politics of nonviolence and things like that. And that was really important to certain parts of the movement, but they weren't the only ones. There was also people that were rioting in cities and armed groups and things like that. So there was actually quite a few different kinds. So I think it depends on what the goal of a particular project is in the larger matrix of these social movements. Some of them, I think it's totally important to have a public face where you can like explain yourself and do those sorts of things. I think other ones have a different goal in mind and they want to see through that goal, and perhaps dressing in scary black masks to stop from being identified by the far right is actually successful for that particular goal. But again, there's also some other bigger issues that be at play here. It's that there's, for example, there's racial disparities in how protesters are treated by both the state and the far right. And you'll often find like folks that are not comfortable with, for example, like white folks dressing in black and attacking folks where it might actually come back on a community of color. That's not a uniform thing at all, but it is part of the conversation. There's like a lot of these conversations that are really complicated, which is why having hard and fast rules about it, I think aren't going to apply. I think sometimes it makes sense to like dress up and communicate and be articulate and send someone to the press like we're talking about. I think sometimes it makes sense to do the opposite. But one thing is that I do think that a lot of times respectability and even worse, civility is a cover for maintaining the status quo. And the status quo is vastly unequal and built on systemic violence already. And so I think one of the fundamental things about anti-fascism is it's not about returning to the status quo. It's about confronting the insurgent threat, but also confronting the conditions that built it, which was the status quo to begin with. So it's always about digging a little deeper. So we can't rely on the return to civility because civility was always a cover of white supremacy.
Great note to end on. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts, Shane. I just want to mention to the audience that our next talk is Tuesday, October 20th, Exploitation, Not Reparation, What 21st Century Activists Can Learn from the Endurance of Racial Capitalism and the Valiant Struggles Against It by Dr. Edward Onachi. He is the author of the book Free the Land. And we do have as a separate series tonight, Dennis McDonough talking, doing a fireside chat on a variety of issues, political and otherwise. So thanks so much for your words and insights, really helpful stuff. And hope we can get you onto campus at some point down the road. So thanks, Shane.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. The questions were great.
Great. Okay. Everyone have a great day, and we will see you at the next event.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.